What's up, guys? This is Coach Grant with First Down Training, and today we're going to be talking about 4 of the best tips that all quarterbacks need to hear to take their game to the next level. So I hope this video helps you guys out. Hope it could teach you a few new things, but also, fellas, if you are a quarterback and you want to get better at reading defenses, check out that very first link in the description below where you could get access to 500 plus videos just like this one where we break down defensive coverages, the best plays that'll work against those coverages, and how to identify each one. Each specific video is broken down into playlists. We upload 4 new ones each week. This is like the Netflix for football IQ, fellas. So check out that very first link in the description below if you're interested and want to improve your reading defense's ability. Let's get started with this video. So now the first tip for quarterbacks that I want to discuss is the throwing motion. How are you supposed to take the football back? Is there a right or wrong way to do it? And what's the most successful way to do it? So we look at this clip here from Aaron Rodgers. Now, Aaron Rodgers has a very unique motion, right? Probably the quickest motion in the NFL. If anybody's ever seen this dude throw in person, it's one of like the prettiest, craziest things you'll ever see. Like it's just a quick flick of the wrist and the ball jumps off of his hands. But I want you to pay attention to how he takes this football back initially, getting to something we call like an opposite equal position. Now, this specific position, I honestly think is different for every single quarterback. Some quarterbacks have a very quick, I call it a backstroke, the like kind of term that's thrown around like the quarterback training world is called opposite equal, where like your arm and your front arm are opposite, but they're like equal and like level. They're both like level if you want to say. But I call it a backstroke, right? So you take the ball back. I honestly, the only thing I don't like for quarterbacks is when they drop the ball down and when they lift the ball straight up to 90. Those are the 2 positions that I would say will not make you as efficient. And we're going to explain why throughout this entire video. But I want some kind of a backstroke position. I think that's the first thing that all quarterbacks need to get down with their motion because it will help time up their entire throwing sequence. And we're going to talk about what the throwing sequence is, all the details of that, again, as this video goes on. But you see how he doesn't lift the ball directly to 90 because that's what caused that ball to dip behind his head. He takes the football back to some kind of backstroke. You want to get to this position, your backstroke position. Some quarterbacks hold it a little higher. Some quarterbacks maybe have the nose of the football down like Tom Brady. Some quarterbacks might have it a little bit lower. But as long as they get to one of those positions as the front foot hits, that allows their hip rotation to bring their arm up to that 90-degree angle. Guys, when you lift the football directly to this 90-degree angle and you have those hips rotate through, when that back hip drives, that ball starts to dip behind your head. That ball dips like almost behind your shoulder, and that can put a lot of pressure on your elbow and on your rotator cuff. So what you have to do is on the foot strike, you have to get to this opposite equal backstroke position. Does not need to be perfect, but when that front foot hits in your throwing motion, that is where you want to be. Okay, so that's the first thing that all quarterbacks need to be more successful with their throwing motion. Don't lift to 90 and don't drop it too low. All it does is throw off the throwing sequence. So now I keep throwing this term out there. You keep hearing it from me called throwing sequence. So that's the second thing that I feel all quarterbacks need to focus on to be successful. So what the throwing sequence is pretty much broken down into 4 specific parts. So the first part is going to be your base. You have to get to a base where you have about 60 to 70% of your weight loaded onto your back leg. You don't want your feet to be super wide. You want your back foot to literally be underneath your armpit. What I tell my quarterbacks is you want your head to be slightly outside of your hip and outside of your knee because that will make sure that that foot is always underneath your frame. Now, why is it important that you have your weight loaded on your back leg and you have your foot under your frame? Number one, it's so you can rotate at your hips, which is the third part of the sequence. But also the second part of the sequence is going to be the front stride. So when you have your weight back like this, when your feet are inside of your shoulder frame, it makes it very easy to rotate from your hips. And I think anybody who knows anything about quarterbacks can agree that their throw power comes from their hips. It comes from their hips and it comes from their legs. So that is the first position that we have to get to. Now, when you are at that position, to make sure that your hips rotate through, you have to take something we call a short front stride. So the front stride is pretty much the step of the front foot when you throw. You need to make sure that that step gets into the grass. I tell my quarterbacks, you want to think about stepping down. How quickly can your toes hit the grass? That's what you want to think. You don't want to think you are pushing off of this back foot for a stride. You don't want to step long. The longer you step, the less power you are going to have. So we want to make sure that that front foot is firing right into the grass as quick as we can. So when that front foot gets down, And since your foot is under your armpit, your head is slightly outside of your hip and your knee, that puts you in a position to where you can rotate, which is the third part of the throwing sequence. Now, the last part of the throwing sequence is going to be the shoulders and the football. And that ties in to the first part, or the first tip that we went over in this video. When you guys take the ball back, remember, what'd you not want to do? When that foot strike hits, where'd you want to be with the ball? Backstroke. Doesn't need to be a perfect L, doesn't need to be a perfect opposite equal, but we need some kind of backstroke. Because remember, foot gets down, what's the next part of the sequence? That's the hips. So those hips have to rotate through, bringing the arm up to 90 degrees. Imagine if when Rodgers was here, good base, he takes a good front stride, but his front shoulder comes open and his arm comes open. He spreads his chest. Guys, your shoulders are going to come through before the hips do. You have to make sure that you get to this backstroke position, and when you get to that backstroke position, you have a slight rotation of your front shoulder, because that puts you in a position to generate something called torque. And that's the whole purpose of this throwing sequence. You guys might be wondering, well, why is the throwing sequence important? As long as I can get the ball there, who cares what my throwing sequence looks like? And guys, honestly, it matters because it takes pressure off the arm, makes us more efficient, and it gives us more power in the long run. So remember, what was the first part of the throwing sequence? We needed a base, right? You needed weight on your back leg. You needed your head to be slightly outside of your hip and your knee. And when you have that weight loaded on your back leg, it makes it very easy to rotate your shoulders back. And when your shoulders are back, remember, we had to get to a backstroke. When that backstroke happens, your front shoulder is closed and that front foot is down. Those hips have to fire through next because we had a good base. So when those hips fire through before the shoulders do, that is how we create torque. That's how we get a whip to my arm, and that's how I can get more distance, more velocity, and I'm using my body, not just my arm, to make this throw. But all of those parts, those 4 parts that we talked about, all work in sequence with each other, aka why they call it the throwing sequence. So remember, you have to get to this base, not just so you can rotate at your hips, but so you can rotate your shoulders back. So again, first part is the base. Then we need a short stride. That short stride makes sure that my hips can rotate. But while those hips have to rotate, they have to rotate before my shoulders. So my shoulders have to go back on the step, and then those hips bring the upper half through, getting to that backstroke, and then the hips bringing me up to 90, tying into the first tip that we talked about. So guys, the throwing sequence is the key to being an efficient passer. But you can't have an efficient throwing sequence if you don't have the correct backstroke. So that's why I suggest start with the backstroke of your motion. Then let's focus on the sequence, and now we're going to talk about a couple other things that will tie into your throwing motion. So now let's look at this clip here from Anthony Richardson, right? He arguably, I personally think he has the best throwing mechanics in this past year's draft class. I think the way he throws the ball is insanely smooth. I know he's not proven. I know he doesn't have the greatest, game film as some of the other quarterbacks, but in regards to throwing mechanics, it is as good as it freaking gets. So we obviously got to focus on our throwing sequence, right? We got to focus on the stride, we got to focus on the base, the hips got to go through before the shoulders, and he has all of that. But another thing that I want to talk about that all quarterbacks need to focus on is their head and their front side when they throw. So let's look at this throw from Anthony Richardson. So he throws, got to that backstroke position, but when he lets go of that ball, he gets to a position called extension. So extension is when you pretty much snap that release, right? So it's pretty much like your arm extending to the target. That's pretty basic day one quarterback advice. Everybody talks about flicking your wrist, following all the way through, aka extension, right? Now you cannot get to proper extension unless your arm is inside of your frame. So what do I mean by inside of my frame? I mean the same thing as like your feet. Like when you're in your base, I was saying that you want to have your head slightly outside of your back hip because your feet can stay inside your frame. Same thing with the arm. We don't want my release point to be way out here, outside of my frame, right? We want it to be inside of my frame, almost at like a 90-degree angle. Can it be a little lower than this? Absolutely. It's just got to be inside your frame. And that comes from front side discipline and your head staying level. And that is what every single quarterback should focus on next, I believe. You want to focus on your backstroke. You want to focus on the throwing sequence. But at the release, you want to try to keep your eyes level, hand up by your face like you're eating a sandwich, and your shoulders and hips should stay parallel to the target because that is what keeps that arm inside your frame and allows you to just straight up extend. Now imagine what a lot of young quarterbacks do at this point is they will take this elbow and that elbow will drop down to your hip. Now when you throw, your spine is heavily involved with the throw. right? So when this elbow starts to drop down, what do you think that does? That brings your spine down. And when your spine goes down, where do you think your arm goes? Your arm goes up high, and it's pulled off of something called the midline, aka your spine. So that's why we want to try to keep this hand up by my face, like I'm eating a sandwich, because that will ensure that my release doesn't get pushed up high. Now, why is that bad, you say? Because if you release it too early, that ball's sailing. If you release it too late, that ball's finishing in the ground, because it's outside of your frame. It's preventing extension. And extension is where you get that snap and that accuracy to the ball. Now, another mistake guys will make. Remember I said shoulders and hips got to stay parallel to the target. How many quarterbacks have you seen get to this point right here, and then this front shoulder rips open and ends up almost behind you? When that front shoulder starts ripping this way, what do you think your release does? Remember, think about your spine. Your release widens and your arm's coming across your frame. That's why it's important to stay level shoulders, level hips. Something I tell my quarterbacks is you want to try to bring your throwing side shoulder to your front hand. You see how that right shoulder goes to his left hand. That ensures that his shoulders stay level. And then last but not least, you want to keep your eyes level and your head steady. Because the one thing, you could keep this hand up by your face, you could try to stay level, but if your head is dipping this way, that really pulls your spine to the left. And what does that do to the arm? It widens it outside the frame. So if you guys can almost pretend, hand by your face, like a big metal pole going straight down your spine, and you're just trying to rotate on it, that's going to help you keep this release more inside your frame. You will be more accurate, and you'll get more snap of your release. Because remember, that extension point is where spin comes from and where accuracy comes from. So now, last thing I want to talk about here is this throw here from Patrick Mahomes. Now, am I saying that you have to make this type of throw? Absolutely not. Patrick Mahomes is a freak athlete. If any of you watch that quarterback documentary on Netflix, they talk about how he's got some of the strongest like hip and shoulder separation there is. Like he's just a freak athlete and he makes freak type throws. That's why he's able to do these types of things. Career baseball guy, etc. Now, the reason why I want to include this clip is the last thing that I want all quarterbacks to understand is that there's no right or wrong arm slot. Okay, so what do I mean by arm slot? I mean this right here. There is a lot of information out there by a lot of quarterback coaches, and a lot of it's copy paste, right? One quarterback coach will say something, then 5 other just copy what he says because they think that, oh, well, if I copy this, I'm going to get this type of view. People are going to watch this. They're going to think I'm smart, etc., right? And a lot of people don't even know what they're talking about in the first place. Now, with that being said, there's a lot of information out there about this lower arm slot and why it's better. And this is the new wave. This is why, the game is changing. We all have to throw with this low arm slot. Guys, you don't have to throw with the low arm slot. If you have a lower arm slot, great. If you have a higher arm slot, great. There are a million different arm slots in the game of football. We look at this. Let's go back to the very first example here of Aaron Rodgers. Let's look at his arm slot. Where is it at? Pretty much over the top, right? Now we look at this example of Patrick Mahomes. Pretty wide, right? Pretty sidearm. Now, the one thing that both of these quarterbacks have in common is a stable front side and a stable head. Because guess what? That allows them to do what with their arm? It allows them to extend. You see that right there? That's called extension. That extension point is what we are looking for in any arm slot. I don't care if he's throwing this thing like a submarine pitcher in baseball. He needs to keep the shoulders and hips level to the target. He needs to keep his head steady and his hand up by his collarbone because that does not let the arm fly outside the frame. Let's say Mahomes was going like this, and let's say he was throwing and he was here, but this shoulder was ripping way open, his head was dipping, and he was trying to throw a sidearm. His release point would be so flawed outside of his frame. His arm would almost be like damn near parallel to the ground, and that ball would take off on him because he has a wild front side. But if you stay stable with the front side, keep your head steady, you can get to that extension point. It's like your arm is almost like a lever, right? Now, again, same thing with Rodgers, and he was throwing a different pass. There are different arm slots for different throws. What is Mahomes having to do right here? He's having to throw around a defensive lineman. That's not every single throw, guys. Not every single throw you're going to have to throw around a defensive lineman. What if you're throwing a touch fade ball and there are no offensive linemen around, no defensive linemen? Probably going to have a higher arm slot, but you still need a disciplined front side and you still need to extend. Guys, those are the things that are important. The front side discipline is what's important. Should you work different arm slots? Absolutely. I think that's good to have. It's a good tool to have in your toolbox, but don't think that every throw should be thrown like that because it doesn't need to be. Right? It's just have a comfortable arm slot, be able to change the arm slot, have your own type of motion, but try to focus on the things that we covered in this video. Because the things that we covered in this video is what I feel will make you more efficient in your own way. All right, fellas, really want to thank you for watching. I really appreciate it. If you have any questions at all, don't hesitate to leave those in the comment section below. Always appreciate the feedback. It's always great to hear from you guys. And again, fellas, if you would like 500 plus videos, all based on how quarterbacks can read defenses, check out that very first link in the description below. We'd love to get you on that, fellas, and help you improve your football IQ. I'll see you guys next time.